Hello, my finance teacher here. Let's have a look at crude oil prices today, and I hope today, guys, you are having a nice day. As you guys know, I do like to look at cycles for different kind of assets and their price action. And the cycles for crude oil are generally all over the place. They can last from anywhere between half a year and they can stretch for over a year. This is a chart going back to 2014. And with these blue lines, I indicate the cycles as I see them in crude oil. There are basically a couple of patterns that I look on the chart, the couple of patterns that I look for on the charts to identify if a cycle low has been reached. One of those, of course, is oversold levels on RSI or RSI reaching close to oversold levels. And another pattern is oscillation of the price around its moving average. In this case, this is a 20-week moving average, and each of these cycles in its advancing phase, it does break above the 20-week moving average, and its declining phase, it does break below the 20-week moving average with some conviction that gives me an indication that a cycle low has been reached. For example, over here in the middle of June this year, oil price did break below its 20-week moving average. However, I'm not really sure if that was our cycle low. I want to see some conviction. And what that gives me is sort of a stretched cycle in crude oil. So crude oil has been a little bit tricky for me. If you guys have any ideas on how to identify more consistent crude oil cycles, I'd be really interested to read your ideas in the comments below the video. Because one other sort of indication that I look for in cycle lows is general duration in these cycles, and as I mentioned already, crude oil price doesn't really follow cycles with a more or less stable duration. There are a couple of other indicators that I look for when I try to identify if the cycle lows have been reached, and we can talk about those in some other videos. If there is interest, you might indicate so in the comments. Today I want to continue with something a little bit different. Rather than talking about the cycles themselves, I want to talk about crude oil price, of course, and I want to show you this chart. This is from the Energy Information Administration. This shows changes in crude oil stocks in the US in each month, averaged over the last 8 years since 2010, 8 or 9 years. So, for example, on average, in each June, the crude oil stocks in US fall by this much, nearly 7 or 8,000. Whatever it's in, it's probably in thousands of barrels. So that's what this chart shows, and what we see is some sort of seasonality in here. We see that generally in summer stocks drop, meaning a relatively large consumption of crude oil in the months of summer. And we see something similar happens in the months of winter, whereas in autumn and spring, crude oil stocks in US generally actually grow, which means the consumption of crude oil in those seasons is not as high. So at the moment, of course, we are in August, and I'm expecting, according to this chart, an increase in crude oil stocks in US and a reduced consumption of crude oil over the next several months. So for that reason, I expect some decline in the crude oil price with reduced consumption of crude oil until we get closer to November, until we get closer to winter. So that's my expectation for crude oil price over the next couple of months, over the next several weeks. It might get a little bit interesting as we move closer to November, as we move closer to winter, to buy some of crude oil ETFs or some of large oil producing companies. But at the moment, I would not jump into this trade. But basically, I just want to give you a heads up that this is one of the trades you might keep an eye on over the next couple of months. One of the reasons I like to keep an eye on this industry is because some of the largest crude oil producing companies in the world, such as Shell and BP, actually pay nice dividends, and it's often a nice just buy and hold strategy that applies for those stocks. For example, at the current price levels, Shell and BP pay something like 5.5% in dividends per year, which is not too bad comparing to sort of say an interest rate you can get from a normal deposit in the bank, savings deposit in the bank. So this is the weekly chart and the tricky cycles on the weekly chart. I want to have a look at slightly longer chart for crude oil as well and see if there are some technical indicators that can help us a little bit with those tricky cycles and some forecast in crude oil price. So over the last several months, crude oil has increased well from around $43 all the way up to around $74 or so. And we actually see a resistance line around that price level, around 75, that is formed by those several lows we saw in 2011 and 2012. Another long-term resistance line is of course formed by this downtrend line that connects the highs in mid-2008 and in mid-2014 as well as mid-2013. So those I think are going to be pretty formidable resistance zones, especially the latter one, this downtrend line. So crude oil price, this is a monthly chart, has sort of hit its head on the lesser resistance line at $75 and we're moving down. I expect crude oil to dip below the 12-month moving average. This is a 12-month moving average, so it's basically a one-year moving average. And the question is basically how deep will it dip? So let's have a look at some potential support zones. There is a potential support zone formed by this high we saw in mid-2015, but it is relatively close to where we are already. So I think there is a high chance that over the next several weeks or a couple of months, this support zone is going to be broken. So I'm not really going to look at that. The support zone that I sort of expect to hold is somewhere around 55 to let's say $52. Support zone somewhere in that range of prices. The RSI over here, we're not that far from overbought levels, so there must be some movement down in the crude oil price so that we have some sort of a cool down in the RSI. So on the crude oil, I expect something like this going into this zone into, well, let's say November, and after that into winter as consumption of crude oil in US increases. I foresee an increase in price, and the big question is going to be, is the price going to break above those resistance zones close to $75? How do you guys think? Are we going to see $80 oil by say December? $80 oil for your Christmas present. How about that? Let me know in the comments below. And over the next couple of months, as we move into November, if you are interested at some crude oil ETFs, of course, the largest well-known one is the USO. That's by far the largest ETF. And some other ones that are also relatively large is the DBO, UCO. Of course, the chart looks similar for all of those. We are waiting for this peak as consumption increases and stocks decline, which is likely to have an upward pressure on the crude oil price. Remember to subscribe to the channel and hit the like under the video. Thanks a lot.